Everyone. This is our sixth call in the Narrative Project. Seems like we've been around for a while, but it's really not been all that long. But it kind of coincided with the beginning of the lockdown and all of that, and everybody going online. So in a way, it was a good timing. We were already planning to do this even before all of that. My name is Susan Smokowski, and I'm co-hosting with Maggie Burton. There she is, calling in from Newfoundland, Labrador. And we also have some wonderful guests that you'll be meeting soon. I'm part of the narrative team, and our team members are here too, and we're all taking turns hosting these calls. I also just want to acknowledge that most of us, not all, but most of us are on the ancestral lands and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Innu, and Inuit people. So we're hosting this virtual space, but we're being hosted by this land, Eastern Canada. And today we're building on the conversations that started last week, which were focused on food, and we had a couple of farmers visit us, and Duncan and Jason hosted that. And we're continuing on today with that theme, partly because it was just, there were such great stories and we wanted more. And also because it's kind of an experiment, an exploration around this question of where do we go next, or how does this work grow? And we're not going to do this every time, but today we just thought we'd pause a little bit and revisit the same topic, but through this lens and this exploration of how does this build? And Shanae Swart, who is with us, is going to say a little bit more about that as well. And so as part of that, we're going to begin by bringing in some of those stories from last week. And John Ibaka has graciously offered to join us and help us with that. And John is an accomplished musician. Some of you know him. And he's a keyboard artist, a songwriter, producer, arranger, recording engineer, and he works with musical styles ranging from world jazz to rock and R&B, and works with artists from all parts of the world. And he also happens to be Duncan's dad. So we're really happy to have him here. And John, if you want to just step in, take it away, and we'll go from there.
Duncan asks that we build on what was discussed last week. So Duncan started last week's discussion, similar with Susan, thinking the bridges between food and music, and saying we thank the land that's around us. So I'm just going to do an improvisation, and his voice will echo out to the rock in Newfoundland. And then at the end, Coco Love inspired from the writing and the comments of last week, created this improvisational piece. So similarly, I'm going to build on that music. I've sort of put it edited version to keep the time down, and I'll just sort of jazzify it and add a bit of color on top of it, and we'll build, and all based on the inspiration. And in traditional fashion, we'll start with the powwow drum.
Welcome to the Narrative Project, the stories we live by. As we come together in this virtual space, physically sitting on the ancestral land of the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Innu, and the Inuit, we give our deepest thanks for being here, for the people who have stewarded the land before us.
Food is a universal language. Food is a universal language. Food is a universal language. And I love it, and I love it, and I love food. We need to find ways to scale it up, 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 up. I love the story of turning a potato farm into an organic green farm. Food is a universal language. Into an organic green farm, yeah. Food is a universal language. Into an organic green farm. I gotta go up here. Someone right at the very beginning said something about their mother writing a book when she was 85. I love this. Check this out. This is our next chorus. Here we go. Every bite affects the world. 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 Every bite affects the We're at a pivotal and important moment in time to speak our dreams for food wholeness and to act together to create sustainable change in our communities. We have the opportunity to be part of a very important movement, and the time is now, 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 now. The time is 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 now.
That was beautiful. Thank you, John. Wow. Shanae, would you like to share a bit about being nourished by these stories and thickening stories?
Beautiful. Thank you so much, John, because that's exactly what we do with our stories. The layeredness of the music, the voices one over the other, the connection in the web of stories is really what this work is about. How can we come together in this feast every Thursday or whenever you meet on a Thursday, so that we bring the stories of our lives and the meaning we make collectively also of those that we witness, those that we listen to. And in the end, these stories become rich descriptions of a future that we want to be part of. And thank you so much for joining us again. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We have the wonderful capacity as human beings to make meaning. We connect the dots and we connect the notes. In this case, John, we connect the notes. And together we have songs of our own lives, but then our own stories are also connected to a larger whole. And this and the larger whole and the web of stories that we are all connected to is also part of a world that we often take for granted, and a world with COVID-19 that have been quite challenged, a world that we take for granted that is kind of standing on the stage with a king without any clothes on. And now our stories and what we want to do here is to weave all of our stories into a world that we take for granted, and then to see how can our collective stories be alternatives? How can our collective stories be counter narratives or competing narratives to the ones that we have been used to hearing and have been exposed to? And I see this collective gathering also of a naming of the alternative. And so for now, we're going to go into connecting as human beings in community also. After connecting with the music and the previous story coming into this room together and into this gathering, we also now want to go to our own meaning making and to imagery around food and community and connection. And the question will appear magically in the chat. And then when we go into our breakout rooms, you can just click on the chat again and voila, the question would be there again. So what image comes to mind when you think of people enjoying or sharing food in community? And then we will also have two wonderful guests talking about this topic. But we first want to bring our own meaning making and our own stories into this conversation. And then the next question, what about this image is important to you and matters to you deeply? We will be breaking out in groups of 3, and each of us would have 5 minutes to share. I think there'll also be a clock just showing you how much time is left so that you're not swished away in the middle of your sentence. So we're going to invite you now to go into small group to meet a gorgeous stranger that Zoom will connect you with, and to share a conversation about your imagery when it comes to people enjoying and sharing food in community and why that image matters to you. Each of you would have 5 minutes. You can't trade your minutes. You each have 5 minutes to share your own meaning making moments and stories, and in that way we are also weaving a wonderful tapestry of our own imagery and stories around this topic. So I think it's Olu that has the magic.
Duncan Ibarra and Josh Smee. And I hope that the breakout rooms was an opportunity to get you in the perfect headspace. One of the things that came up for us just then as we talked about the fact that music and food often really go together and are paired. Like how often do you go out for dinner or have a big party and there's food around the table and there's also music playing somewhere? That's certainly a Newfoundland experience. The kitchen party is a kitchen party because it's in the kitchen and there's always food and there's always instruments, there's always singing. So it's a perfect way to start us off, I think, even through this period of social distancing. Yeah, so Josh Smee, I'm going to start by introducing him. He is an old friend of mine at this point. We've known each other for 10 years. And when Josh first moved to St. John's, his wife, Lauren, was in my violin studio. So we did our music degrees sort of side by side, and she still teaches my daughter violin. So we interact in many areas of our lives. But now in my work on City Council in St. John's, and Josh's work with Happy City St. John's, Food First NL, and the community market, the St. John's Farmers Market that he was instrumental in starting up, we often overlap in these spaces where we're trying to creatively solve a problem together. And it's often about food or access to food, or, how do we make sure that we get food into the hands of those who need it? And in January, we had a state of emergency in St. John's where thousands and thousands of people were without food for days on end because of many reasons, but one of which was all the stores were closed. So we were navigating that, and Josh was really helpful in that process, even though he was just a few days into his new job as the executive director of Food First NL. So talk about somebody who's able to think on his feet and move very quickly. Josh is that person. And over the last few months, he has moved some mountains, some metaphorical but very real bureaucratic mountains, in order to really disrupt the traditional way of getting money, for example, from the provincial government out into the community to make sure that people get the food that they need. So I'm going to ask him some questions about that during our time together. And Duncan, many of you probably know Duncan already if you've been on these calls, so he's been a familiar face. So he runs a community oven in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And it's the universe is an interesting place. This morning I was on the phone for half an hour with somebody who's trying to set up a community oven in St. John's. And they had a bunch of questions. I said, you should probably reach out to my friend Duncan in Nova Scotia, who has done this work for quite a long time. And he's, probably got a lot of bugs ironed out already. And she said, oh yeah, I know Duncan. I've been there. I've had that pizza. Actually, it's really good. So great. Anyway, I'm going to put the two of you in touch. But a lot of my early memories of hanging out with Josh at his house when he first moved to St. John's were on Sunday evenings. He would host a potluck and invite just about anyone he would meet throughout the community, and started a really early sort of mutual aid group on Facebook called St. John's Friends. And this is in 2009 or something. So it's quite early in terms of social media organizing. And every Sunday night, everyone in St. John's knew they were welcome at Josh's house. They wanted to come with a plate of dinner so that they didn't have to eat alone. Very cool. And Duncan has comforted me a couple of times now with food when I've been having a hard day during our work with We Beast and Inspiring Communities. So very fond memories of both of you when it comes to food. So Duncan, if it's okay with you, I'd like to start by asking you a couple of questions. Duncan, can you take us to a recent moment in your food work that was sticky? So something that was, presented some challenges, like when you're trying to cook and you burn something onto the bottom of a pot and you got to try to figure out how to get that off. Could you take us to that moment and describe what happened?
Sure. I've been having so many lately. So I guess one that really sticks in my head was just the other day. So I live in a shared household, and one of my housemates does a lot of different work in the community, and we were talking about our previous experience with gardening and working on farms. And I was saying how kind of food and the oven, missing the community oven quite a bit right now, was really like a place for creativity and joy for me. And so we're standing in the kitchen while we're doing this, and we're making this beautiful salad with like carrots and these Asian greens that have come out this year. And she was like, food is not really joy or creativity for me. It's satiation. So when I eat local food, it's rich and satiating, and I feel good for hours. And I looked down at my plate and I thought, wow, there's all of these colors, and these carrots remind me of visiting a local farmer, and asking him, well, why are these carrots so good? Why do they taste so good? And he said, oh, it's our soil. We've been working on this soil for 15 years. So that kind of has really stuck with me, and this that there are these different relationships to food, and that I can continue to learn in this local space, has really stuck with me. I'm not sure it's sticky and the challenging of times, but it challenged me to think of the different relationships that people have to food, and how that can come up, and how we can bring that up in these kinds of spaces. It's those kind of conversations that sort of inspired this work in this project for me.
Absolutely. And I know you mentioned something in one of our conversations recently about sort of putting your own doubts aside and trying to grow your own food in your house, for example. So right now, a lot of people are starting to plant seeds if they can get their hands on any, and having a little go at that. Is that an experience that's sort of outside of your comfort zone for you? Are you working in that space for the first time?
Yeah, it's new and old for me. So my mom always had a big garden, and it always seemed like a chore to me to go out there and work the garden and so on. But that's sort of shifted a lot for me recently, where I let some of the fear in of what's going on in the world in terms of our food security and beef plants closing down and such, and kind of use that to channel this need for more gardens and infrastructure distributed in communities, and started gardening. So we've built 4 raised beds here, and actually asked some neighbors if we could use their raised bed, or their backyard basically, and so we have a lot of gardening space pretty quickly.
That's wonderful. Another question I have for you is around a moment that really stands out that you will never forget, and I'm hoping it has to do with food. And you can try to ask yourself, who was there, and how did your actions impact that situation as well? How did you make others feel? We're talking about community, so I've been thinking about like how our own individual relationships with food and the moments that we find ourselves in can really impact the community around us or the people around us. So I'd like to encourage you to think about a situation where there was more than just you in the space that you will never forget, and to describe that with as much detail as you can.
There's so many. So what first comes to mind is the community oven. So our community oven, we had 35 or so events last year. And one in particular, many stood out. Trying to think of which one to share here. Sorry, really doing this spontaneously. One stood out for me. So we did an event with someone from Sandy from Glooscap First Nations, and she told us about the story. It was about making Looskii bread. She told us a story of Looskii, or also known as bannock, in other parts of Canada, or four cents in Cape Breton. And so we had all of these people with like their hands in this like flaky dough, listening to this story of how her grandmother passed it on to her. And it was called 4 cents at the time because it was kind of the cheapest food that they could get at the time. So oil, water, salt, and flour, sometimes sugar if they had it. And it was just a moment where I thought, wow, she's explaining how food culture 80, 100 years ago was in such a place, and also poverty was in such a place in Nova Scotia. But she's doing it by telling us about a story about her grandmother. And all these people are super engaged. And so I just was thinking about how food is this medium for connection and having these stories told in ways that aren't abrasive, that build bridges.
So you mentioned that, someone else you talked to, for them, food was about satiation and not about creativity or improvisation, or I forget exactly what you said. But for you, is there a creative element or an improvisatory element that you enjoy with food? When you talk about, there's this bread that you can make that, you use what you have. You use the oil, you use the water, you use the flour. And if you have sugar, you use that too. There's something about the spontaneity of trying to use what you have and work with the materials that are disposable to you that I love about food. Like, do you have a relationship with the creativity of the food world that sort of keeps you in it, do you think?
Yeah,
you seem to me.
For sure. Yeah. So we kind of regularly organize these, what we used to, creative gatherings where we try different recipes out, and we actually eat beforehand because we spend so much time creating.
You don't want to be hungry and angry at each other while you
Yeah. Yes. Hangry is a real thing. Yeah, so I have a pretty deep relationship with experimentation. It's like one of the ways that I process all of this heady work.
Well, I was just thinking about your father and you are obviously, you have some things in common, and the improvisation in music and the improvisation in food often brings the greatest joy in an experience for me. If I'm in the kitchen or if I'm making music, those are some of the places I feel the most free and the most able to explore. I love to create things without recipes. And, many of us sitting down with our mud pies when we're 5 years old, it starts really early. One last question for you, Duncan, if you wouldn't mind. I'd like to know what your wildest dream is, but I want to know specifically about your community oven project, which is such an inspiration, like I mentioned, to even people in St. John's randomly that know about your project. You mentioned it around the community oven. For that, what would you like to see happen?
I think I would love to see everyone have a creative, like, co-cooking moment. Yeah, ours is in the middle of the park.
The oven, yeah.
The oven, yeah.
Can you take us to the oven right now? I know a lot of us are in our homes and haven't left for quite a while. What does it look like there and smell like on a nice hot summer day when things are working fine?
Sure. It's warm because it's at 700 degrees ideally, or 600 to 700 degrees when we make pizzas or flatbreads on Saturdays. It's usually bustling because it's starting just kind of at the tail end of the farmer's market. So people are coming through. It's in a grassy spot in the middle of town on Front Street in Wolfville. And it's between the liquor store, a doctor's office, the library, and all the main pubs. And on the way to the farmer's market from the parking. So it's a very hopping place. People arrive there often with dough, but also with veggies, and set up their family kind of picnic tables. And some people like me even bring tablecloths. And then people get in the dough, and so they're stretching dough. And there's one moment I never forget where there was actually 7 children with all of their hands in the same dough, kind of pulling it apart together to make these apple turnovers.
Wonderful.
So that kind of happens all the time, and people arrive, and suddenly there's enough food for everyone.
Yeah, is there enough dough? Do we need more dough? These are some questions I've heard you ask as well. But dough is something that can be stretched and can be modified, to feed however many people that the ingredients allow for. But you always need more dough, right? That's the idea.
I don't know. We when it arrives in 20-gallon buckets,
right, there's enough dough.
There's enough dough usually, yeah.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm going to move on for some questions with Josh, and I encourage everybody to sort of hold the feeling that you got from hearing Duncan speak as we go on to Josh, so that when we go to our next breakout session, you can really feel the different energies that the two of them bring to their work, because they're quite different. So I'm really grateful for the participation of you both. So Josh, I have a totally different question for you, but it's also a moment question. I want you to take us to a moment in the last few months when something just fell into place. So everything suddenly, the stars aligned, and there was this moment where this was your experience. Who was there, what was said, what shifted, and just try your best to bring us into the room or into your headspace or how you were feeling about that. So again, a moment where things just clicked finally, or things clicked unexpectedly. You didn't know it was going to happen. Anything at all.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Maggie. I probably have a couple that come to mind that would be good to share. I'm thinking first back to the experience that we were having in January, when our world was shut down in such a strange way by weather and the snowstorm that for folks who aren't in Newfoundland, it's almost hard to explain what it was like in this kind of beautiful, strange world that we were living in. So to give some context, like my street was buried in maybe 4 feet of snow, and I woke up in the morning and I saw someone going down in skis, and then all the kids on my street piled out of their houses and were snowboarding down the street and all this. And so there was this weird little surreal world where like there were these pockets, like my individual street was this pocket of joy where people were just out playing all the time. But at the same time, none of us were prepared, I think, for the impact that physically shutting down people's ability to move around the community for 10 days would have on some of the real like basics of life, right? And so it's funny, like we talk a lot about food insecurity these days. We don't talk a lot about hunger. We don't use the term hunger that much in policy circles anymore in my world, but it was a real thing. People were hungry in the most visceral way at the time. And one thing we realized is that where things were breaking down, and I think like I was part of this kind of extended conversation that was happening in many different ways. And Maggie, you were a part of this too, of course, because you're on council, and this was, I think, I found that whole process very fascinating because no one was sure for a while where problems would get solved. I think in these unexpected situations, we were all casting around and sort of throwing ideas and problems and solutions at a wall, and seeing what stuck, right? And it gradually became more and more coherent. And I remember one afternoon during that experience when a large kind of mutual aid project had formed in downtown St. John's,
Yep.
But not serving just the downtown. And so Maggie's familiar with this, but it's called the Stone Soup Cooperative. Lots of people know the Stone Soup story. But one thing that had emerged is there were a lot of people who were, suffering or in need of immediate help, who weren't sort of attached to our systems of social support, in that they weren't attached. They weren't an agency's client, which is language I hate anyways. But there
or
were
like
lots
a community center. They didn't belong to.
They didn't belong to anybody. Yeah, exactly, right. In a service way, and so this mutual aid group formed to mobilize resources, and also nobody had the capacity going into that to get food to people's doors. There was always the expectation that if you needed help, you'd go out and get it, and that just wasn't physically possible then. Now it's not possible for public health reasons, right? But it's a very similar situation where there was this gulf between well-stocked shelves and empty pantries, right? And I'm remembering the moment of walking into this big, gigantic old mansion on Military Road in St. John's, which had been taken over as sort of command HQ, right? And there was this big, enormous table in the center of this big, enormous room in this ornate Victorian house. And it was packed with people, many of whom I knew, with laptops out and every other spare surface covered in loaves of bread and cans of beans and cars coming and going. And I brought my daughter with me, and she's just a bit past 1 now. And her favorite thing to do is help, right? And one of the concepts she understands best is helping. And I remember just standing in that room and just saying to her, like, look, all these people are helping. And I think for me, as someone who's often involved in organizing things and in policy advocacy and in kind of slow, unglamorous behind the scenes work, the moment of being able to just grab up a load of groceries and carry it to someone's door was really meaningful for me, actually.
Yeah.
I really miss it personally. I miss the experience of just being assigned a task that can help a human and going and doing it. But there was this moment when I realized that so many people in my community were recognizing how complex their own community was in terms of need, and the fact that behind the doors that they passed every day, there were folks who are being, very systematically excluded from the lives that we think that we can live. And my life and work changed a lot after that, because I used to go and do media interviews in my job, and people, the first few, now I used to, this was like a few weeks in, but the first couple of media interviews I did in my job with Food First, people mostly want to talk about either growing more vegetables or worrying about the ferry, because those are the two things people really cotton onto about food in Newfoundland, especially, is that, we're an island and there's distribution challenges, or that it's hard to grow stuff here. And it was really a hard slog to move those conversations to be about the impact that poverty has, because that's what actually is really driving so much of the work that I think many of us are doing in food. But then as soon as this whole situation in January happened, and I think it echoed so deeply with people that a lot of my work has been done for me. I don't have to try and set the terms of the conversation anymore. It's really lovely. So I remember sitting in that room, and it just all kind of clicked right there. Yeah.
Do you mean that, like, the work that you don't have to do right now is because there has possibly been some sort of a mindset shift where people sort of get it a bit more?
Yeah, exactly.
Instinctively?
Yeah, I think, people sometimes have to experience things in a visceral way, right?
Yeah.
In a visceral way at a community level, and that echoes. Like, my world is mostly policy and decision making, but I saw how many people who were in positions of power suddenly realized that, we have a problem here, in a way that they never had before, right?
And a lot of the time, if you have any lived experience in these institution areas, like I do, so I have to spend a lot of time trying to describe to other people what it's like, and you can't get it. You can't get it unless you live it sometimes. And I think that this made it a lot more possible for us to move things quickly. I really do. I want you to speak very quickly to us before we go into our next breakout sessions about the mountains that I referenced, because I know you know what they are. I'd like you to describe and for everybody that's watching, me and Josh, we're both existing in the policy space. I'm the co-chair of the Food Policy Council in St. John's too. We're hoping to do a lot more work on trying to address food security in the city. We're working on asset mapping. We're trying to figure out where the food gaps are in terms of access. And I know that these are jargony words, but they're important for policy people because we do have a common language. But Josh, do talk to us about what it's like to step out of that behind the scenes thing and move the mountains. What mountains did you move, and what changes have you made? I think it would be really valuable for people to know.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces, just on a practical point, is money. Like, money still matters in this, right? And coming into the COVID-19 situation, we were in a position that I was getting phone calls from people in positions of power saying, what do we do? And I was able to communicate that clearly we were facing a food security crisis because of COVID-19 in a number of ways. And I was so lucky because I get the call that says, what do we do? And I say, give people money and don't judge. And I think like that message was able to carry farther than it normally would. And so part of the pitch that we made was, you know, that we're not bound, my team, by the same kind of procedural barriers as lots of, you know, bigger organizations and institutions are, right? And so what ended up happening was that the resources that were freed up to support sort of emergency food supports in the province, we were able to flow through us, and it was pretty significant. So you know, it started at $500,000, and it's grown. It's closing in on doubling that by now, and from different sources. And we were able to say we can flow it through us, and so some of that money is now buying ammunition and gas for people's snowmobiles so that they can go out and hunt a bear and put it in the community freezer. And it would be very difficult for more sort of complex institutions to spend money on that. But it's not for us. And so like we've seen all this kind of, it's been so fascinating for me to see, I think, what happens when you trust people. You know, what happens, not to say that there's no control on how this is working, but I think like not having unnecessary barriers has opened up a lot of places, and getting the sort of just doing stuff
like,
quickly and figuring it out as you go, right?
what becomes possible if you just make that leap across the divide that needs to be replaced with. And the scarcity mindset issues, you know, right? When people talk about food, it's, is it going to come in on the ferry? Do we have enough grown here? We're an island. What are we going to do? Or, you know, we're up north and it's really tricky to get the planes in. So there is a lot of scarcity, understandably so. And many of us are alive right now in our communities, lived through the Second World War, or, you know, we're children of people who did, and there was a lot of real shortages, and a lot of the habits around that time still exist today, I think, and we've really inherited them from our ancestors. So yeah, thank you, Josh. That's wonderful. I encourage folks to follow along with Food First NL and the work that they're doing. I'm going to ask at the very end of our call some sort of concluding thoughts to Josh and Duncan. If so, you can think if there's anything that didn't come up right now that you'd like to mention, you'll have an opportunity at the end. Okay, so thank you. So our very next thing we're going to do is breakout room number 2. And I'll thank Olu in advance for posting the questions into the chat. He's so fast and wonderful. Look at him. So the questions are going to be, what struck you from what you heard? Did something connect with your own experience? If so, share that story with your group. And what is your wildest dream for the future of food in our region? So these are groups of 3, about 5 to 7 minutes each, but we're gonna keep the total of time at 20 minutes so we can clue up. So it might be a bit more like 5 to 6 minutes each. So we'll see. Anyway, so enjoy. We'll see you back on the other end.
Hello. I can't hear.
Hello.
Hi.
I love your back.
Welcome back, everybody. I apologize for any abrupt endings of conversations that we were having. We were having a lovely chat in our breakout room. Sometimes I wish we could just stay there all day. So we're at the point in our call now where I would like to do the harvest, and I don't think we're going to have enough time to do another musical performance, so we're going to leave that for now because I realize we're 4 minutes away. I just wanted to before we do that, just invite Josh and Duncan. Just think about it for a couple minutes during this harvest, and maybe you could speak while people are processing what happened if you have any burning thoughts to say. So I'll invite you to do that. But for now, in the chat box, did today's conversations shine a light on anything you didn't see before? Is there anything you would like to share? So please open your chat box and think about something that maybe rose to the surface for you in our discussion. And if there are any points that Josh, you or Duncan would like to address while we're doing that, you could do so, maybe in like 1 or 2 minutes. So yeah, if there are any conversations, did the conversation shine a light on anything you didn't see before? Is there anything you would like to share with the group?
I might share something that came out of our conversation that we just had, which I think Duncan touched on it when he was talking as well. Just about the complexity of our relationships with food and of these conversations. To not always go into them assuming that food equates with a positive thing or with community in all of our lives. I think it's really, we had a conversation about this in my group, and just that some of us have been through circumstances in our lives where either like our individual relationship with food has been a difficult thing or a challenging thing, or a guilt-inducing thing about providing for others. And I just think food and community go together, but food and community are not the exact same thing, you know? It's worth reflecting on the fact that there is also some really challenging and difficult and sometimes negative relationships that accrue around food that we should recognize and hold space for and work through in these conversations. I think that's just one thing that stood out to me out of some of the chats.
Thank you, Josh. John, you are welcome to sort of play quietly in the background if you would like to. I will invite you to do that if you would like. We just have a couple minutes left, so I wasn't going to demand any musical performances in such a short frame of time, but we've had a request from the group. If you would like to play, you're very welcome.
Sure, I'll give you just some reflective music so you can type by.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you. Just trying to fit in a lot in this short amount of time. My apologies to everybody. While John is still playing, I would invite Francis. Actually, I'm not sure if we can hear two streams at once, but we can try. Francis is going to host next week's session, and it would be wonderful if she could give us a bit of a heads up about what to expect.
I'm muted. Sure, I can do that. I guess building on that theme of connection and what sustains us, that we'd look at looking at intergenerational gifts. and what we may have received from generations before us here in this region, whether they be from our own ancestral lineage or maybe from people that we've chosen to live with. And just looking at how those gifts sustain us in this time and how we can bring those into the future. So it's still a work in progress. So we will be sending out some more information on that, and really hoping you can join us.
Susan, if there are any closing remarks, you can feel free to make them now.
I also, just on behalf of Anne Burrell, who is also working on an artistic project with Coco's performance last week, is looking for visuals that might have arisen from today or last time, from our food moments. And she's going to incorporate those into a video. So Anne is here. You could hold up your hand, Anne. But just send those to her, or send them to me if you don't have her email, and I'll forward those along. And I just want to thank all of our guests, John and Shanae, thank our hosts, and Maggie and Jason, sorry, not Jason, but Josh and Duncan, and everybody for participating, bringing your stories, questions, traveling along with us. It feels like such a rich river that we're all contributing to, and so much is coming out of it. Just look at this chat right now. It's amazing. So thank you for coming, and we'll be back next week. And maybe we can, I don't want to stop because I don't want to cut any more of these chats off, but it is time to close. So maybe we can just have a moment to do a little gesture, whatever you feel like, to say goodbye and thank you and gratitude to all of you. And we'll see you next week.